For true creepy neighbor stories. Story 1. When I was in my early 20s, I moved to a new neighborhood. It was a quiet area, not far from the city. My place was a small townhouse that was more than enough for me. The rent was affordable, so I was happy to find it. It was only the main floor with someone's house higher up. It had 2 bedrooms and an open space where the kitchen and living room were. There was only 1 bathroom, but since it was just me, it was fine. The spare bedroom wasn't used for much. He intended to turn it into a guest room, but he hadn't done so yet, so at that time it was just an empty room. There was a small closet at one end and a window at the other. I always kept that window closed and locked because I never used it. I took a night job at a local warehouse, which meant my sleep schedule was all over the place. Most days, when I wasn't working, I found myself up all night. I hadn't felt trying to sleep at regular times anyway, so I just adopted the nighttime lifestyle. Since I was at odd times, making friends was difficult. I'm quite a sociable person, but even after 4 months of living there, I still didn't know most of my neighbors. My next-door neighbors to the right were a young family I had only met once or twice. There was also a single guy a few years older than me, whom I had never really met. I had only seen him once or twice. Other than that, the rest of them might have been unknown. One night I was sitting on the sofa going through the TV channels. It was around 4 a.m., a time when virtually everyone else would be asleep. Suddenly, I heard a cracking sound. It was soft, but enough to pique my curiosity. Like I said, I had a townhouse, so there were occasionally noises from my neighbors at this time, although it was rare. I decided to investigate just to put my mind at ease. So I got up and walked around the house, but the sound didn't happen again. I checked out the living room, kitchen, and even the small bathroom. Nothing seemed to be out of place. I was about to return to the couch when I looked down at the spare room. There was something strange about the window. I walked over and stood in front of her. The window, which he normally kept locked, was broken. The glass wasn't shattered, but the latch was broken and clearly not fully closed. I took a closer look, and when I inspected the screen, I could see a small sled that I didn't think was there before. He hadn't opened that window, and no one else should have either. At that moment, he was pretty sure that someone had entered. I didn't know if they were still in the house or if they were gone. I ran to my bedroom to make sure nothing had been stolen. The only really valuable thing I had was my MacBook Pro, but it was in my bed where I had left it. Although somewhat relieved, he now knew that it was not a robbery. If anyone was still in the house, there was no way of knowing how long they had been there. He had only noticed a slight creak, but there was no way he could have missed someone opening that window. Surely he would have made a more serious noise. Maybe it happened when I wasn't there and the person was at my house somewhere waiting for hours. I wasn't going to take any chances. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the house, locking the door behind me. Although it would not help at all. As I was walking down the street, I called the police. I waited outside, wondering what the hell was going on behind me. I thought I was going crazy, maybe too much coffee and sleepless nights. The police arrived after a while and entered to check the house. After a few tense minutes, I saw them leave. They had found someone inside, one of my neighbors. It was the guy I'd seen, but never really talked to. The police said he seemed disoriented and confused, and that they found him in my bedroom closet. I thought he was drunk or something. They took him into custody and left me to piece together what had happened. Sleeping was difficult for the next few days. Some time later, I learned from the police that my neighbor claimed that he had gotten drunk and mistaken my house for his. He had broken the window when he couldn't get in through the locked door. I think that's nonsense. If he had broken in by accident, why did he hide in the closet? If he thought it was his own place, then he would have gone straight in. That guy must have been there for hours with me, and the only sign of him was a slight creak and a broken window. I later found out that everyone in my neighborhood thought that guy was a weirdo too. The raid was a terrifying experience. I stayed in that place almost a year after this happened, and that guy was still around when I left. It was strange to see him on the streets, but neither of them said a word to the other. The idea that someone was in my house, hiding in my closet while I was there, haunted me. I became more cautious and always double-checked the locks on all doors and windows before going to bed. Even during the day, I felt restless, as if someone was lurking in the shadows. My interactions with my neighbor after that event were minimal. I would see him occasionally as I walked around the neighborhood, but we would never exchange more than a simple greeting. However, every time I saw him, a feeling of discomfort invaded me. I couldn't shake the idea that this guy had been hiding in my house, watching me, without me knowing. Eventually, I decided to move. Although the rent was affordable and the house met my basic needs, I could no longer bear the feeling of paranoia that overwhelmed me every time I was there. I looked for a new place in a different neighborhood, one that would offer me more peace of mind and security. When I finally moved in, it was an immense relief. I was able to put that scary episode behind me and start over in a place where I felt safer. However, the memory of the man in my closet never completely disappeared. I always remained alert, aware that danger could be anywhere, even in the most familiar and seemingly safe places. From then on, I learned to trust my gut and take extra steps to protect myself and my home. Story 2. I'm 32 years old, but when this happened when I was 12 or 13. My family and I lived in a house in a middle-class neighborhood. It was 2 stories with a finished basement, so there was plenty of room for me, my brother and sister. My sister was 2 years older, my brother 1 year younger. A lot of our neighbors also had kids, so it was that kind of neighborhood. My best friend lived just a few houses away, and my brother's best friend was right next door. The family across the street was a bit older, so we didn't know their kids very well. We will call them the Hernandez. There was a boy and a girl in that family. The boy, whom we'll call Ramiro, was a year out of high school at the time, but still living at home. The girl, whom we'll call Samira, was a senior in high school. One thing was well known in our neighborhood, and that is that the Hernandezes hated their next-door neighbors. I never knew who started it, but families fought like animals. The police were called more times than I can count, often for silly and minor things like noise complaints. The Hernandezes even called the police once because the dad thought someone had left leaves on his lawn, but they were actually from the trees. The son, Ramiro, also had a bad reputation in our area. My parents always told me not to talk to him, even though I was much younger and probably wouldn't have done it anyway. I don't know everything he did, but one event still stands out. One morning, as I was walking to the bus stop to go to school, I noticed that one of our electrical transformers was smashed. These transformers looked like large metal boxes on the side of the road. Honestly, at the time I didn't know what they were, but this one was in bad condition. I asked my parents about it, but they didn't know. Eventually, I learned that Ramiro had crashed his dad's car into him. The accident was captured by someone's security camera. Ramiro was arrested on suspicion of drunk driving because he was going from one side of the road to the other, zigzagging wildly. Unfortunately, he was released because by the time the police arrived, it was too late to test him. Again, about a year later, I was home for just one afternoon. My dad was working and my mom had gone to take my sister somewhere. I was in my upstairs room doing homework with the TV on in the background. Then, there was a knock on the small window next to our front door. That was odd because most people would use the doorbell. I went upstairs to see from above where the noise was coming from. There was someone standing there, but from that angle I couldn't tell who it was. I didn't bother to go downstairs because the person looked too old to be one of my friends. He wasn't afraid, he was just disinterested. I went back to my room and continued with what I was doing. About 2 minutes later, I heard another knock, this time coming from the back of the house. It was in one of the windows of our deck. This time, I went downstairs because I was curious about who I was. When I turned the corner, the rear windows entered my field of vision. I saw Mr. Hernandez standing there in our backyard looking out the window. This may not sound scary so far, but remember that our families were not friends with each other. There really wasn't any reason for him to come to our house, especially not to our backyard. I turned around and got out of sight as quickly as possible. When he was in the other room, he was pretty sure he heard him try to open the door. I wanted to call my mom, but I knew she would be home soon anyway. I waited another 10 minutes or so and then saw his car pull into the driveway. I told him what had happened, and when my dad got home, we saw the footage from our security camera. It showed our neighbor coming up to our house and knocking on the window like I said. But the really creepy part is that it showed him trying to open the door that was locked. Luckily, he didn't go in or do anything, but he was pretty scared. My dad went to confront Mr. Hernandez. He denied everything at first, but when my dad yelled that he had video evidence, he just made up some excuse. He told my dad he was checking on me, that I was too young to stay home alone, even though I was 13 and it would only be for half an hour anyway. How would he have known? Was he looking at our house expecting me to be alone? Things got better with them for a while. No one moved out until after I left, so those were my neighbors for most of my life. The son, Ramiro, ended up being arrested a few years later. He got in trouble for fighting in the street and got in trouble for assault and some other misdemeanors. He did not serve any jail time because of how messy the men in the family were. The mom always seemed really nice and normal, the same with her daughter. I didn't know Samira very well, but sometimes I saw her playing basketball in the driveway and she seemed likable. That's all I can say about the Hernandezes. I don't know what he wanted in our house. I still have a hard time believing that he would really want to hurt me, but why else would he try to enter our house while I was alone? I'm glad the door was locked. Although those incidents were disturbing, I didn't have any problems with the Hernandezes again after that event. However, we always maintained some distance and caution around them. Overall, those years in that neighborhood were a mix of happy times with friends and family, but also marked by some tension and unnerving situations with neighbors. Over time, my family and I moved to another place, leaving those experiences behind. But the lessons learned about the importance of safety and security were never forgotten. Those memories are still vivid in my mind, reminding me of the importance of staying alert and safe in any environment. Story 3. This happened in my old apartment a few years ago. It was one of those new condo buildings downtown, the kind of place that looks like a modern art exhibit on the outside. It was basically all glass on the outside with balconies for each unit. I rented the place through a friend of mine who bought the unit a few years after college. She got a job in another city and decided to rent it out as an investment instead of selling it. At the time, I was looking for a new place, so it was perfect for both of us. He treated me well, as we were friends and I knew I would take good care of him. I knew some of the neighbors beforehand from when I used to visit. At first, it was like a small community. My place was on the 18th floor and had only one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room. Outside the bedroom, there was a small balcony and there were windows on either side of it. In fact, all the exterior walls were practically floor to ceiling. After the first year, my neighbor moved out. He was a quiet guy in his 30s and was quite nice. The guy who took his place was a bit older and gave me a bad feeling from the start. He had long hair and always wore a baseball cap. When he first moved in, I introduced myself and found out his name was Liam. Liam worked from home and I don't think he went out much, except to go to the store. Sometimes he heard strange noises coming from his place from time to time. Sometimes, out of nowhere, I would hear him shouting swearing. The walls were thick, so I know he must be screaming loudly. I didn't know for sure if it was a really serious anger issue or maybe I was a passionate sports fan. I know some people get into those games a lot, unfortunately, it seemed more like the former. One night I was lying in bed. It wasn't that late, maybe it was around 8, it wasn't completely dark yet, but the sun had almost set. I was looking at my phone and my balcony door was to my left. Suddenly, I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. It seemed to be something outside my window. I put down my phone and turned around, but it was gone. I thought it was a bird, but that was rare on the 18th floor in my town. After looking out the window for a minute, I gave up and forgot about it. Another night, about a week later, I went out with some friends. I was the designated driver, so I didn't drink when my friends were having their last round, though I did order a coffee just to make sure I was awake enough to drive them all home. Therefore, when I finally arrived at my place, I was not ready to go to sleep. I stayed up for about an hour watching TV, but when the clock struck 3 a.m., I decided it was time to go to bed. Still, he wasn't tired. At 4 a.m., I still couldn't sleep. That coffee seemed like a good idea at the time, but it was actually keeping me awake. He was lying on his side looking out the window. The city skyline looked good at night and I was watching it as I tried to fall asleep. Suddenly, I thought I noticed something. It was a flashing red light on the other side of my window, right next to my balcony. I watched her for a few seconds without being sure what I saw. It wasn't clear if it was near or far, but when it suddenly went up, I knew it was close. I got out of bed and walked to the window. When I got there, I could see that it was a camera on some kind of selfie stick. It looked like it could be a GoPro or it could have been a regular camera, but I knew my neighbor was spying on me. Seconds after seeing him, he was jolted out of my sight in the direction of Liam's apartment. I got really scared at that point and called the police. To my surprise, they didn't do anything right away. Apparently, my word wasn't enough to record his place. I stayed with my mom for the next few days because I was too scared to be home. I made sure to tell my neighbors what I had done, even though when I got back to my apartment, Liam was still there. But fortunately, it didn't last long. I don't know how, but the police finally managed to search his place. It's unclear to what extent he was involved, but espionage wasn't the only illegal thing he was doing. The cybercrime unit in my city was also keeping an eye on him. Once he was arrested, I never saw him again. They allowed me to see the images I had of myself, but I declined. There was no reason for me to do that to myself. The police also told me that they didn't think I had ever shared them publicly, so that was good for me. It's the worst thing that has happened to me to have my privacy violated in that way. Even though Liam left, I started looking for a new place right away. When my friend found out what had happened, she was more than happy to let me break my lease. Story 4. Before I bought my house, I lived in some shady places near some troublesome people. I could go on and on about some of the things that happened to me during my 20s and early 30s, but this is the worst. I had a small apartment in an old building, and that's where I lived when I finished high school. He worked in an auto shop doing mostly oil changes, and the pay was barely above minimum wage. Therefore, this was the only place I could afford without getting roommates, something I desperately wanted to avoid. My place was literally a single room with a kitchen in one corner. My bed was right in the middle of the room because there was no better place to put it, otherwise, you'd be blocking the door. At first I was happy enough, but the real problem was the neighbors. Since the building was old, you could hear everything. I don't know why old buildings are so bad in that aspect, maybe sound insulation hadn't been invented yet or maybe it was poor maintenance. All I know is that my apartment was constantly flooded with conversations, footsteps, and every other noise you can imagine. My neighbors on one side were a married couple in their 30s. They were particularly loud and argued all the time, often late into the night. The man's name was Martino, he was a lawyer, and the woman's name was Jane and she was a receptionist at the time. When this happened, Martino had been out of work for more than a year, and money was one of the main things they argued about. Their fights became a regular thing that I looked forward to in my afternoons, and I often tried to drown them out with music or TV shows. It wasn't just his screaming, he also heard things being thrown occasionally. I could never know if there was physical violence, but it always worried me. When I saw them in public, it was like they were a perfect match. They always showed a happy face to me and the others in the building, but we all knew what was going on behind closed doors, to some extent. I could never understand why they did it, they must have known that people could hear them. I was never sure how much to tolerate before calling the police. I had never intervened before this incident, but I was around a few times. A month before this happened, I woke up in the middle of the night when one of them must have thrown something against the wall. It was a loud bang and a sound of glass breaking, so I think it was a glass. I almost called the police, but I stopped because things seemed to calm down soon after. Another night they were arguing as usual. I remember sitting on my couch trying to listen to some music, but the noise was so loud that even my over-ear headphones couldn't stop it. I turned up the volume and managed to mostly ignore it for the next hour. Around 11 o'clock, the noise stopped. I was getting ready for bed and I didn't hear anything else from them by the time I went to bed. I assumed they had done the same because I was calm. As I was lying there trying to sleep, I heard a sound that could have been a gunshot, then a woman started crying. I knew it was Jane. For a moment, I stood there in shock, then got up from my bed and lay down on the floor for safety. I didn't know if these walls could stop a bullet. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking as I explained what I had heard. I remember my voice cracking as I spoke, and I tried to stay as calm as possible so no one would hear me. The operator told me that help was on the way and not to do anything else. I followed his advice, moving away from the wall he shared with the couple. From the moment the shot rang out, I heard Jane's cries and sobs, but nothing Martino's. It was an ominous feeling to be there and listen. I kept praying to hear screams again, but that never happened. With each passing second, I feared more and more that Martino was dead. A little later, I heard the police approaching the building. The sound grew louder until it stopped just outside. I looked out the window and saw police cars and an ambulance parked outside. I walked away from my door and heard the cops banging on the door of the couple's apartment. It sounded like 10 or 20 people had rushed into his place, police, paramedics, and so on. There were voices, but I wasn't listening to them carefully. Anyway, it was just standard police procedure. Jane was crying and wasn't making much sense. After a while, I heard Jane being escorted out of the building, but I couldn't tell if she was under arrest. The tension in the air was palpable, and I found myself pacing back and forth in the apartment trying to calm down. The next day, I learned from another neighbor that the woman next door had been arrested for shooting Martino. I was called as a witness because Jane claimed that the shooting was in self-defense. I thought that didn't make sense because before the shot, there was basically silence. If it had happened in the middle of a fight, then maybe self-defense would be credible. I told the police what I heard, and several of my other neighbors did the same. Martino was in serious condition for several weeks, but eventually died from his wound. Based on my statements and those of several others, Jane was eventually charged with murdering her husband. The trial is scheduled for early next year, but I hope I don't have to testify.